Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Priznat kao vodeći stručnjak za islam i geopolitiku na području Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, profesor religije i međunarodnih odnosa na Georgetown Univerzitetu u Washingtonu, direktor princ Waleed bin Talal Centra za muslimansko-kršćanski dijalog, član Vijeća od 100 lidera Svjetskog ekonomskog foruma, konsultant za islamska pitanja američkom State Departmentu i brojnim globalnim korporacijama, univerzitetima i medijskim kućama. Gost emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je John L. Esposito.
Professor John Esposito, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
The Egyptian military has, since its toppling of the democratically elected government, jailed key members of the Muslim Brotherhood, killed hundreds of the supporters, and they have now taken steps to legally ban the organization. And they have also curbed basic human rights and media freedoms. All this with the explicit support of major Western states. In whose interest is it for Egypt to be a general's republic?
Well, from my point of view, it ought to be in nobody's interest. But the fact is, to begin with, for a number of the governments in the Arab world, which are not, if you will, democracies or even popular democracies, don't have popular participation, the prospect of the Arab Spring spreading across the Arab world was seen as a threat. So for those governments, this is far more preferable. From their point of view, just as Mubarak and Ben Ali were fine people. There are certainly many people in the West who, whether they like authoritarian governments or not, as in the past, just felt that in terms of the national interest of their countries, it was better to have authoritarian rulers who were allies that they could work with, that it was in their national interest. So for a long time for the United States, in terms of its interest, access to oil, the safety and security of Israel, what it would like to have seen done in terms of Palestine and Israel in terms of the resolution of the conflict, this was acceptable. Now, the EU and the US have not embraced or totally supported the military coup. But the fact is that certainly, if one looks at the U.S. response, the failure of the U.S. to use the word coup and to be very strong about it is a matter of concern.
But the Muslim Brotherhood was in power for only 1 year. Wouldn't it have been fair to allow them to, stay in power until their mandate ended, and then only judge their results?
Well, it seems to me that not only would have been fair, it was the thing that should have been done, and from my point of view, had to be done. If you embrace a democratic process, not just elections, but a democratic process, then that process is that if you have an elected government and you disagree with that government, then when the time comes, you vote them out of power. And so, for example, Egypt had parliamentary elections coming up. That would have been a fine place. So people who were demanding reforms, from my point of view, should have been demanding reforms across the country and demonstrating, etc. But it should have been reform, not through a coup overthrowing a government. And there could have been a use of the process through parliamentary elections to indicate and to create a situation where Morsi as president would have to deal with a parliament that totally disagreed. Clearly he had a constitutional court that still would have disagreed. The fact that that process has been hijacked or overthrown, I think, creates tremendous problems with regard to the future. What's the precedent? If you don't like the next government, then you immediately don't like the election returns, you just simply overthrow the government. And I think what makes it even worse is not just the military takeover, but in fact, the military saying that it's simply coming in, it's an interim government, it's going to have elections. None of that has happened so far. Saying it's going to be inclusive government and then turning around and not just attempting to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, but the massacres that took place. And those words need to be used. Regrettably, some Western diplomats have not used that.
The Egyptian military has enlisted some high-ranking Egyptian Islamic scholars such as Ali Juma, Sheikh Ahmed El Taib, even the popular televangelist Amir Khalid to back them up. Why are some high-ranking Islamic scholars in Egypt backing the military junta?
Let me begin by saying that it's not clear where Amr Khalid really comes down. Amr Khalid has maintained that a statement that he made about supporting military had more to do, excuse me, what was going on in terms of the fight against terrorists, outside of Cairo, in the more, from my point of view, remote areas. But it should not be a surprise. Atayeb, Ali Guma, who are very good scholars, and certainly Ali Guma has a very strong track record as a religious reformer. I've written about him in my book, The Future of Islam. But the fact is, when Mubarak was overthrown, both of them were actually against that kind of uprising. And then after it, Atayeb, accepted the results and move forward and try to be a mediator with the government. So the fact that Atayeb and Ali Guma then went along with what happened with the military takeover is not a surprise. Also, historically, both of them have been very strong critics of the Brotherhood or any Islamic political party. Ali Guma was on record during the Mubarak years of being against the idea that any group should call itself an Islamic political party.
Now, how do you interpret the growing number of attacks against Coptic Christians throughout Egypt? Is this the work of pro-Mubarak thugs known as the Baltajia? And if so, why are they doing that?
I think you have a combination of things happening here, and I think one has to sort it out. The fact is that there are three possibilities. Okay? One clear possibility is thugs, and there are reports. We have reports in which you have even local citizens and some Coptic religious leaders talking about the fact that their churches, etc., have been vandalized by thugs. Thugs don't just come in and vandalize, they actually steal objects, etc., that they intend to sell. So we certainly know that thugs there. We also know the use of thugs. It has occurred under Mubarak, and it's been used by the police and military at times, because you then have your thugs who are not official members, who aren't wearing uniforms, and are causing problems. And the involvement, therefore, of police and military in either standing by and allowing it to happen, or even encouraging it. Because the more that you can have that kind of action, the more you both terrorize your Coptic population, and you also alienate the outside world, particularly, let's say, Western countries, Western Christian countries, Christians who live outside, who see this as simply a religious action and not a political action. A third option, clearly, is that you have disaffected members of the Muslim Brotherhood. While the official Brotherhood has said consistently that it made strong statements, but strong statements that have talked about the response to the coup, etc., has to be nonviolent. The fact is, if you're a younger Muslim brother, or a Muslim brother who loses a family member or some friends, the danger is that you are going to then respond to what you see as a hijacking politically, but more importantly, you're going to respond to those people who you see as having killed your own people. And so therefore, first of all, you'll be firing on police and military, but also, regrettably, what has happened is the Coptic Church has come in for fire. It's had problems in the past in terms of extremists going after them. But the fact that the Pope of the Coptic Church both supported the coup and then was quoted with the crackdown, the very strong crackdown and use of military force at a certain point, of thanking the government and the military for assuring the security of Egypt. For those, for others, he was seen as aligning himself, and he, like Atayeb and Ali Guma, were in the initial photo that was taken when Assisi announced the military takeover. What is missing, though, is that there are Copts who have clearly distanced themselves from the Coptic Pope in terms of his politics.
Amnesty International has recently accused Erdogan's government of, quote, gross human rights violations, unquote, during the Gezi Park protests. When you look back at the protests in Gezi Park a couple of months ago, did Erdogan's police resort to excessive use of force?
I think there were clearly incidents where they did, and I think that even members of the Turkish government, acknowledge that there were moments when there were excesses. The president of Turkey, Abdullah Gül, while being supportive of demonstrations and reform, but not supportive of the extent to which I think some of the leaders of the demonstrations got out of hand in terms of what they were demanding, what they were doing, and what they were provoking. Certainly, I don't think would have approved some of the excessive actions of police. So I think that one cannot deny that. I think that the challenge that Mr. Erdogan has, and I think that the recent reforms that he's put in and other things, is that one knows that not only is the international community going to be watching, but that within Turkey itself, Erdogan has led a party that has brought a level of prosperity and a level of stature to Turkey that did not exist under previous governments, however much they saw themselves as secular, enlightened, etc. But what happens when you have power is that if you're not constantly listening to people and in touch, you then are seen at a popular level as not as responsive as people want, and you leave yourself vulnerable to your, if you will, your professional opposition, what I would call the sore losers, the political parties and the hardline secularists who from the very get-go do not want to see the AK party successful, and the more successful they are economically and politically, they feel threatened and disenfranchised and therefore want to bring down the government. And I think that, a cadre of those folks were influential in what was taking legitimate demonstrations that people certainly have a right to have throughout a country and attempting to push that into creating conditions to bring down a government.
Right. Speaking about the recent package of reforms, it eases restrictions on the use of minority languages, it reduces the threshold for political parties entering the parliament, and it also eases the ban on headscarves in the public sector. Now, some opponents of Prime Minister Erdogan say that this is yet another example of his hidden Islamist agenda. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that I've seen in the Turkish press, you've got both those that approve and those that are critical. You certainly have Kurds who feel that he did not go far enough, but you have non-Kurds. You have people who are just against the Erdogan government who feel it didn't go far enough. And one can get into those kinds of arguments. Could he have done X or Y? Should he have also announced at that time, the return or opening of the Greek Orthodox seminary? I think that there are a number of those kinds of issues there. But the idea of saying it's part of an Islamist agenda, when people use that kind of rhetoric, to me, that's what I see happening that comes from a kind of, again, marginalized group that doesn't want to admit that although it had influence and power in the past, it represents a minority of a country, has always represented a minority of the country politically and economically, but has controlled in the past and been a major power politically and economically. And so how do you then critique a government, both not only within your country, but what you want to do is critique it vis-a-vis the international community, vis-a-vis the EU and the US and the international community. You use the phrase that they're trying to Islamize society, they're trying to create a brotherhood, they're trying to AK party, a society, etc. This has nothing to do. What in that package has to do with Islamization? The fact that there's a further move to allow women to choose whether to cover their head or not cover their head, this is an absurd kind of comment. I mean, the fact is that where you would have Islamization would be if the government were saying that women needed to cover their head. But the irony is that you have sectors of society where women have not had to cover their head, and that sector of society has attempted effectively in the past to force women not to cover their head, and if they did not to be able to enter parliament, not to be able to go to the university. And suddenly when you're simply saying, this is a matter of a woman's choice. That's what it's about. It's not about Islamization. There's a woman's choice here.
Now, just a couple of weeks ago, a limited airstrike against the troops of Bashar al-Assad seemed almost inevitable Yet today, major Western powers seem to be giving diplomacy a chance. Is there a diplomatic solution to the war in Syria, or is a limited airstrike, as was the case against Serb targets in Bosnia and Kosovo, the only viable option?
I think that the problem we have now, potentially, is there's a possibility, and the possibility is that one can do something about the chemical weapons. But doing something about the chemical weapons really does not amount to resolving the war in Syria. So for example, Mr. Assad has said that his expectation would be, having given up the chemical weapons, that the global community, if you will then also and be expected not to provide any arms to the opposition. So if there's going to be, the danger here is that one can talk about perhaps being successful in controlling the chemical weapons. Okay? But if, having been successful, the international community walks away, then that does nothing with regard to resolving the conflict in Syria. Something's going to have to be worked into that negotiating, whereby you have something on the table that both a mainstream, as it were, opposition can mobilize around and accept, and that Assad can accept. The jihadists are never going to accept anything. Okay? If that component is not in there, then to do the chemical weapons and walk away is to leave, and especially if also one takes off the table any kind of arming or response to sectors of the opposition, then you're simply leaving the opposition totally vulnerable, giving them two choices: total vulnerability to Assad and surrender, or, for many of the opposition at that point, turning to the jihadists for weapons.
But why did Washington place the use of chemical weapons as the red line which must not be crossed, bearing in mind that far more civilians were killed with the use of conventional weapons?
Well, I think that has been an approach of the American administration and the EU and many in the international community. It's not just about Syria. It's with regard to, any state. As it was used as a yardstick with regard to Saddam, and ultimately as a quote, regrettably, when those weapons were not found, but was used as an excuse to talk about the invasion. So I think that is an international issue, and that's an easy red line, as it were, to draw, okay? And if you will, an easy first step. And more importantly, the use of those chemical weapons, the fact that Assad had them and would use them, and the knowledge that Assad has a substantial stockpile, that is something that the international community would want to move on. And at least, in the first steps, it bypasses the thornier question, you see. And you see the complication of the thornier question, which is, what do you actually do if you talk about military intervention, when you realize that the British Prime Minister was ready to support some form of military intervention, and he had to accept defeat in Parliament. And that President Obama was willing to make that kind of move, and saw that the polls were overwhelmingly against it, and the opposition continued to grow, not just in Congress, but among the American people. So I think that there are political drivers here.
Right. Iran has been firmly siding with the Bashar al-Assad regime, yet the Iranian president's recent charm offensive at the United Nations General Assembly has been winning the hearts and minds of some. Is Washington ready to talk to Tehran, or will its foreign policy towards Iran still be driven or shaped by the interests of the Jewish lobby?
I think that Washington is clearly ready to talk, just as I think Iran is probably clearly ready to talk. Even Khamenei. One can look at the foreign ministers Zarif and Rouhani and say they sound good, and in fact one can probably look at them and say they may well be very well intentioned, but why is Khamenei also on board? Well, I think that there are practical reasons there, and I think both sides have their practical reasons. They have their own interests at stake. For the Iranians, clearly for, I think, the faqih, for Khamenei, you're looking at, as Rouhani said and as Zarif said, and a stronger public admission of the impact of the sanctions on Iran. And that impact is not, we know the impact has been primarily on the people, quote unquote, rather than the government, but it is strongly on the government, because if the people are devastated by the sanctions, that creates tremendous potential problems for a government in terms of growing opposition, et cetera, et cetera. You know, if you have a younger generation and an older generation that feels that not only is its present terrible, but its future is terrible and going to get worse. So I think that there are very strong economic motivations, okay? You know, certainly for the Iranians. On the other hand, for the U.S., for the sectors of the international community, the concern about stability and security in the Middle East, the concern about not just the growth of terrorism, but just the security issue is very strong.
Now let's move on very quickly to the United States and the question of Islamophobia. Some 30 states have passed this so-called anti-Sharia legislations. And some of these states have very small numbers of Muslims living there. Who is pushing for such, what is clearly xenophobic legislation?
Well, you know, what you have in the U.S., as in Europe, is a growth of Islamophobia. And it's a variety of people that are involved in this. And it cuts across, it's not just religion, it has to do with politics, etc. So, you know, you have what I would call in some cases, in an American context, you have neoconservatives, you have hardline Christian Zionists, and you have people who, for a variety of reasons, are professional. They make money with their websites, with their writings, their books, and being anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. You have political commentators, you have members of political parties. Look at the last two presidential elections, and particularly the Republican candidates. So this fear, irrational fear of Islam. So I'm not talking about being critical of Muslims or people having questions and being critical about aspects of Islam that they see. But we're talking about an irrational fear that then leads to discrimination and hate speech has grown exponentially. And what that means in light of post 9/11, but particularly we saw it with the so-called debate over the mosque at Ground Zero, is after that mosque at Ground Zero, from that time on, you began to see two follow-ups. One was a tendency to take one of the phrases that was used by the Islamophobes, not by those who had their own form of legitimate, from my point of view, concerns, which was, this is a monument to terrorism. This then became the line for mosques themselves across the country. So you had an anti-mosque, prevent mosques, attacks on mosques, etc. You also then had this unleashing of the Sharia frenzy. This is done by the Islamophobes. The idea is you want to promote an irrational fear among people. So what you talk about is the threat of terrorism. You then talk about the fact that not only threat of acts of terrorism, you talk about the fact that mosques may be terrorist places, embedded cells, and you talk about the fact that they've not only come, but they're here, they're a growing number, and they want to take over with their Sharia law. And then you get major politicians, you know, like Newt Gingrich, Michelle Bachmann, buying onto this. So then you have the promotion of this anti-Sharia frenzy, which is ironic. You don't have any major Muslim groups of any significance calling for the introduction of Sharia law in the United States. Under our Constitution, you could not formally bring in Sharia law or any foreign legislation in any significant way.
But it is a fact that Jewish Beth Din courts, Christian mediation services, and even indigenous Indian tribunals already function in the United States and apply their own legal system. Why wouldn't there be place for certain Islamic legal norms to be applied in the United States?
Well, these deemed courts on the part of Jews, first of all, it's important to note that supporters of that system, okay, have also taken a position which is against these anti-Sharia legislation. In other words, they have been, you know, supportive of those Muslims who are concerned about this issue, because it's not only a matter of justice, they also see how it would impact them. And it is a question, you know, if you have a system where you allow, but even under the system that you're allowing, that is structured under the American legal system, okay? And it can be, any decision can be trumped by our legal system, okay? But if you allow for a group of religious leaders or representatives of a tradition to attempt to mediate, let's say in a divorce situation, that can be done. Because at the end of the day, no legal divorce can take place unless, if you will, the mainstream legal system enables that. The mainstream legal system is always able to accept or reject the resolution that would come out of, this, if you will, informal Jewish court or Jewish system of mediation or Muslim system of mediation. But again, because Jews are so well integrated, as it were, and because there is no, as it were, a fear of Jews or fears of Native Americans, irrational fear, the way we now have with regard to Islam and Islamophobia, these are not an issue. With regard to Muslims, what you had is a growing fear, and that fear has been also exacerbated, and one has to remember this, by real events. There was a 9/11, okay? There have been domestic attacks in the United States even before 9/11 on the World Trade Center, and subsequently there have been attacks. There have been attacks in Europe. So, therefore, there is a context within which these purveyors of hate, the kind of anti-Islam and anti-Muslim people, are able, rather than saying, look, there are extremists, just as there are extremists in other religious traditions or in other political movements, but the majority are not this way. Rather, what these people say is, it's not simply the extremists, there's something about their religion. These people are not hijacking their religion, these extremists, it's something about their religion. And therefore, what many of them will say is, look, because it's something about their religion, if you have devout Muslims, okay, they may not be extremists, but because they follow this religion, they could become extremists because this religion has aspects of it that legitimates extremism.
Professor John L. Esposito, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Sure.